At the risk of caricature, I believe that ASEAN, over the past 50 years, has been transformative in its impact. Transformative in terms of intra-Southeast Asian relations, transformative in terms of the relationship between the region, Southeast Asia, and the wider region, and not least of all, transformative in the people-centered way, in the economic betterment, better welfare, and not least of all, attempts at greater adherence at human rights and good governance. Transformative, no doubt, over the past 50 years. I think ASEAN's achievements becomes even more pronounced and even more significant when one reflects on the developments elsewhere outside our region. Northeast Asia, the dynamics on the Korean Peninsula, situations in North Africa and the Middle East, the false promise of the so-called Arab Spring, and the consequent geopolitical tensions that has been occurring, the Brexit phenomenon in Europe, etc. In other words, I think it's rather not too difficult to identify reasons for being satisfied, for recognizing the important steps that we have made, both in terms of where we were before and in terms of where we are compared to other regions. But the question is still begging. Are the qualities that had made us how we are today, are they good enough and relevant for the next 5 decades, given the nature of the changes in our regional, national, and global environment? And I must confess, listening to the discussion today, especially the discussion on the merit or otherwise of non-intervention and state sovereignty, I feel a little bit disappointed because I thought this was a discourse more fitting for the 70s and 80s, and that we are still, after 5 decades, still laboring on this point. And I'm glad that Secretary General Hong Keng-yong, Ambassador Hong Keng-yong earlier reminded us of actually, and this is the point that I wanted to elaborate a little bit further, that the application of sovereignty, state non-intervention in ASEAN has been actually a bit more nuanced, a bit more calibrated than often caricatured. In essence, what I want to share this afternoon is to alert ourselves to the nexus or to the links between national, regional, and global. That we don't, while we are not living in a neatly defined national issues, regional issues, and global wider than region issues, that there are actually linkages, and we need to be smarter in recognizing these linkages so that we can have a more nuanced, calibrated, and appropriate responses. One linkage or one nexus is the so-called national and regional non-intervention, etc. I have news in a way to alert that state sovereignty is not the exclusive preserve of ASEAN. 193 nations of the United Nations adhere to this principle. It is a charter-provided principle, and ASEAN shouldn't be too overly consumed or guilty even, feeling as if this is our own principle that others don't have equal sense of ownership over. But state sovereignty, I think, and non-intervention has to be applied in a new setting. It doesn't mean that we become totally not attentive to developments in our own region. Earlier, Ambassador Hong Keng-yong mentioned what I think ought to be properly recognized. Indonesia purposefully and deliberately tried to change the dynamics in ASEAN on this issue. We purposefully, deliberately, mechanically even, tried to change the dynamics so that ASEAN becomes more comfortable in discussing issues internal to itself. Indonesia in 1998, 1999 imploded, multidimensional crisis. We realized that democracy, human rights, political developments needs to be nurtured, needs to be invested in. And we realized that there is no ASEAN discourse on the matter. We were overly legalistic and assuming that these are developments internal to our own respective countries. We tried to change the dynamics. As Ambassador Hong Keng-yong has said before, we brought Aceh, we brought Sampit, we brought Papua, many other problems of our own making, of our own folly to ASEAN forums. And the response has been, on the most part, deafening silence, for the most part. None of the ASEAN countries wanted to speak about this. They feel uncomfortable. They did not ask for it, let alone expected Indonesia to report on these matters. But myself, as Director General for ASEAN Cooperation, and with Minister Hassan Wirayuda, we said, there's no going back. We are going to go on and on and on about this until everyone gets it. And I have to say that we reach out to the Philippines, we reach out to Thailand, we basically implore them, please don't let us hang out there having briefed you and not say anything apart from the weather. Say something, say what you said doesn't make sense, but make a discourse out of this. And as Ambassador Hong Keng-yong said, eventually, Myanmar began to pick up the same approach, Thailand, the Philippines as well. In other words, that's where I come in terms of the charter. There is no magic wand. Mm-hmm. You can't change culture and habit by adoption of declarations of charter. And believe me, if senior officials are given an opportunity to review the charter, they can go on and on and on and on and on. Basically, a self-consumed process. What's needed is state practice by ASEAN leaders, by ASEAN states. And this is what we try to do on internal developments. I am surprised and disappointed, to be honest, to be frank and candid, by the sense of exasperation now being expressed in ASEAN of developments within its own family members. Right. Exasperation is not policy. Emotion is not policy. You may have exasperation as a person, but not as a state, not as an organization. In the long years of Myanmar, as has been said earlier, ASEAN were united on Myanmar. Secretary General Min and I sat together in the Security Council when Myanmar subject matter was discussed in 2007, 2008, 2009. Not having an ASEAN script was terrible. 2007, Indonesia, as a member of Security Council, abstained in January 2007 when Myanmar was brought to the Security Council. And I came to the Security Council in September 2007. I said, I'm not going to abstain on Myanmar. Why should I opt Indonesia out of this process? But in consequence, we have to take the lead. We have to shape, we have to mold. You cannot be neutral. You cannot be equidistant. You cannot shut out of the discussions. Together with Ambassador Min, we work closely with Myanmar to have a script of ASEAN. Now, on Rohingya, we have a Security Council debate last week. We have a UN Human Rights Council debate also last week. Deafening silence by ASEAN. To me, that is unacceptable. How can a matter that we had so deliberately and patiently invested in Myanmar democratization process, now suddenly we switch off, snatching defeat from the jaws of victory? I don't agree with those who say that Myanmar is, because we were pressured by the UN, by the other external parties. 2011, Myanmar wanted to chair ASEAN, as they did in 2006. Then we encouraged Myanmar to defer their chairmanship of ASEAN for the sake of the wider region, and they then, in their wisdom, agree to do so. And Hamid would remember at the Foreign Ministers meeting in Vientiane in 2005 or 4, I forgot. And then 2011, likewise, they wished to chair. But Indonesia used the momentum to change the dynamics. The prospect of Myanmar's chairmanship of ASEAN becomes propellant for more changes in Myanmar. So once that did occur, it didn't become a source for contention. In other words, it's a caricature to suggest as if national and regional, there is overt tensions. It takes leadership, as had been said earlier, by ASEAN leaders, because there is a key distinction between leaders and leadership. And ASEAN leaders, ASEAN policymakers, must create state practice to give meaning to all the various declarations that they have made. I chair ASEAN Human Rights Declaration. It has to be given meaning. Second point, and very quickly, as I know time is running out before we open up for discussion, ASEAN centrality that has been discussed earlier. ASEAN centrality means we must have a script. What are we central about? It's not just because it's described in the charter, but it means you have to have a voice. You have to make an impact. You have to be relevant, as others have said. It means we have to be united. Thailand, Cambodia, 2011. South China Sea, 2012. ASEAN at the risk of disunity. We can't let that be the final word on the subject matter. 2012 ASEAN, when we couldn't agree on the ASEAN chairman statement, I'm not going to stand still. I'm not going to stand idly by and let that be the last word on the subject matter. Not under my watch.
Absolutely.
Not under my watch for Indonesia's foreign policy. Hence, we did what we tried. Thailand, Cambodia, 2011, unprecedented for conflict among Southeast Asian countries to be brought in the Security Council, and for ASEAN, chair of ASEAN, to speak not on behalf of the country, but on behalf of ASEAN. It means we can do it if the countries concerned have trust and confidence in the instruments that we created. I feel now, to be honest, and I can be very frank and candid now, I feel now we are beginning to be too comfortable and too accepting of being underwhelming, of being disunited, that we say, oh, it's fine, we are. I see chairman's statement by ASEAN now, and I'm not trying to be overly critical. I used to recall chairman's statement belonging to all of us. I see a chairman's statement that looks more like a record of discussions. Some ministers expressed concern on the South China Seas, therefore suggesting this is not the concern of all, but only some, and the like. I think we need to be a bit more urgent, apply diplomatic heft, diplomatic weight to our efforts, otherwise we won't be taken seriously. North Korea, DPRK, many issues on our plate. My final thought, as I see the clock is now barely 20 seconds away. Transformative ASEAN, I think we must be constantly transformative in our outlook, ambitious even. I am a realist, but at the same time, I'm also an idealist. You cannot simply take things as they are, but everyone must bring onto the table for their moment when they have a responsibility, the betterment of the situation. And I feel that somewhere that we have become a little bit too complacent. And we have to be a bit more aggressive in waging peace, a bit more aggressive in waging prosperity. But that's just a thought of a retired person. Thank you very much.